What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Uncensored Podcast. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about all things student loans. And we have a wonderful guest who's going to break it all down for you. So if you have questions about student loans, if you're wondering how you should approach them, then this is the episode for you. So with no further ado, Meagan, how are you?
Hello, I'm good. I'm looking forward to nerding out with y'all. That's what
Awesome.
I'm
Awesome.
excited about this.
Awesome. Of course, we got Jacqueline on as well. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well.
Good, good.
Here.
Awesome. Well, let's get right into it. So Meagan, tell us a little bit about who you are and your background and how you became one of the student loan gurus, if you will.
Yeah, so I went to college with Jacqueline. We were in undergrad together at Coles College of Business up in Kennesaw. And I always had an interest in finance. I went into the personal finance route through an internship. And then I consistently kept running into cases where they didn't really have like the foundational layer of planning done. And I was working at a financial planning firm under two CFPs where, that just wasn't what we were doing. We weren't helping people with budgeting or with, debt kind of, but not like involved. And I also kept running into people who had jumbo sized student loan balances. And I kept thinking, my goodness, how are they going to tackle this to like get to the other side and start to be able to work with somebody on like investing. And so I had left that firm, started my own practice, Financial Coach Meagan, to specifically work with folks who needed the areas of foundational financial planning, like needed help in those specific areas. And then, student loans naturally came with that because I was working with folks who, that was the biggest elephant in the room is their student loan debt. And so my first coaching client was a chiropractor who had 300,000 of student loan debt. Yeah.
Wow.
So that's, and I was excited because that's my first coaching client, but I was like, oh my gosh, how are we going to get past this? And so that's when I started nerding out on the federal student loan system and how to tackle it. And really learned that, like, my goodness, the federal system is complicated and there's lots of things we can leverage though. So I got really excited about how we could maybe take advantage of the system and help people navigate that maybe in a non-traditional way, which, the federal student loans are not a regular debt, that's for sure. So, but, and then here I am, I'm still doing it, still nerding out about it.
Awesome.
So last spring, of course, leaders announced that our student loans were going to be deferred, right? Federal student loans were going to be deferred. Nothing was going to be due until the fall. So when you first heard that, as a student loan nerd, what was running through your mind?
Well, the first announcement with like COVID rolling in was that he was just, Trump was just going to freeze interest. And I was like, that's cool, but that's not going to bring relief to people losing their jobs right now. And then shortly after that, they announced the extension and the 0% interest. And so I thought it was a great thing that they implemented because that does bring relief. And the biggest component to that was that the months that were frozen would still count towards any forgiveness timeline. And so I was excited about that because I work with a lot of people pursuing either public service loan forgiveness or the longer term taxable forgiveness. And so I think it was a good move. And then since then we've seen lots of extensions and we're about to see another one, I think. I think that was probably the best thing to do. The sad part though was that no relief was really standardized for private student loan holders. They were kind of left to their own devices and the companies could have decided to implement like a forbearance, but interest was still going to accrue and it wasn't going to be as nice as the Fed system.
Yeah, so when you're working with somebody, I'm sure you can't ignore their private loans as well. So how do you help people tackle that?
Yeah. And they are kind of they're two different beasts really, because the federal system, we have a lot of flexibility with income driven plans and forgiveness opportunity. private loans, they are not very sexy. We just have to pay them off. And so if I'm working with someone who has quite a bit of both, usually we're leveraging the flexibility of the federal side to help us tackle the private first. And, refinancing is a great way to reduce the cost of private student loans. So we can, leverage that and make sure that together the two different payments that they're going to have is going to fit within the cash flow and also not prohibit them from saving and putting money towards other things.
Got it. And so kind of an abstract question, right? But curious on your perspective about it. So, you help people who have a lot of student loan debt, maybe some moderate, maybe some people with a mountain of debt. So what is your thoughts on people who actually should I still be investing during the time in which I'm paying off debt? What is your thoughts on that?
100% you should be, I think, because, and it's because people, are graduating with very large student loan balances these days. If they have, especially graduate degree holders, very educated people will graduate with probably a lot of student loans if they did not have family help. And, traditional debt advice tells us to pay debt off as sooner rather than later, like our hair's on fire. But traditional debt advice also didn't know that the student loan situation would be what it is today, where even if someone put all of their extra money towards their loans, it would still take them 10, 15, 20 years to pay them all off. Right. And so I just feel like that's precious time that we cannot we can't give up, because we're shooting ourselves in the foot a couple of times if we don't save while we're paying down debt, because it's going to take us time no matter what. And we don't want to be out of the ball game, for that time period and not have our future self set up for success. And student loans are not an asset-backed debt. So we can't sell it once we've paid it off or there's no equity within it. So I think there's always a healthy balance that we can find really with any situation.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? So it's like, even if someone's not a big fan of someone aggressively paying off their house or something, at least if they did that, they still would have that tangible asset, right? Versus if you aggressively pay off your student loans, you just have a piece of paper that says, congratulations, you paid off your student loans.
Yeah. You've got your brain and you've got that piece of paper at the end that you got at graduation.
Yeah, and hopefully you got a degree in something that you are actually using, right? Yeah.
So I know you got my book, Money Planning and Positivity. And so in that, I don't know if you've gotten a chance to read it yet, but in there, I talk about some of the mental health issues that people tackle in life, and a little bit about how I deal with that as a financial advisor. So specializing on student loans, how do you help people tackle that mental hurdle of okay, actually having this debt isn't terrible, because as you just said, once you pay it off really fast, there's nothing at the end of the tunnel except for you just don't see that debt anymore. There's no asset or anything. So mentally, how do you help people work through that?
Yeah. And I will admit, I have not started. I started to read your foreword, but I have not finished your book. I was already reading one earlier this month, so I've got to finish that one first. I'm not one of those people that can switch between books. I don't know. I just can't focus.
Yeah, I'm the same. I gotta get it knocked out once I started.
Yep. But yeah, I mean, student loans and debt in general really has a psychological effect on people. And it is really hard. If someone, if I have a client where it's a clear decision, or it's clearly the right way to go to treat it, or to go the longer term route to forgiveness. And that means, if someone's balance is greater than their annual income, typically we should be going this forgiveness route, because mathematically it's going to make more sense. And then, for other reasons, for savings reasons, it makes sense. But that's sometimes hard for people to stomach, because they're thinking, oh gosh, I'm going to be in debt for 20 or 25 years. And I start to try to reframe their brain around this being a debt, because if we're going that forgiveness route, it's not really a debt anymore. It's really more like a tax. And what I mean by that is, our goal, if we're going towards forgiveness, is we want to pay as little as possible to maximize how much we can get forgiven. And that also helps us leverage our money better by having more cash flow to put towards savings and towards other life goals and financial goals. And so I encourage them to think about it like a tax versus a debt. And I think that helps a little bit. Even if someone, even if that's not the route for somebody and we need to aggressively or pay it down sooner rather than later, I just talk about the value of having money set aside for your future and having other things working for you at the same time. And we talk about it being, the student loan debt is just a bill. Think about it as a bill. We're going to have an efficient plan. We're definitely going to make sure we have an efficient plan, but we also talk through like the value of, what is that extra $200 a month going to do to you if it's invested between now and the next 10 years. And we show them, the how much that's going to grow to, and then how much they would have saved if they put it towards the loans. And, usually if we're putting that towards an investment vehicle, we're doing better, especially if we can get that interest rate really low, because, and I talk about the interest rate game, where if we can get our debt below like 5%, then, we're probably going to do better with that $200 or whatever it is, putting that in the market for ourselves and having that work for us. And, so I talk through those concepts, and I think that starts to help. And I think the traditional way to think about debt is just kind of old. I think debt used to be really expensive. Mortgages and car loans used to be in like double digit interest rates, 30 years ago, maybe 30, 40 years ago at this point.
For everybody, not just those with bad credit.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think the older advice about, and I hate this too, because I feel like people feel bad about their student loans because they go to Thanksgiving dinner and their uncle is telling them, wow, how did you get that much in debt? You're so irresponsible. Why are you not paying that off? Like, having 3 jobs to pay that off. And it's like, well, things have definitely changed since you have been in school. And, debt is just not as expensive anymore. And it helps us leverage our money better, I think. Compared to if we were looking at, super high interest rates. So that's I kind of rambled on a little bit there, but hopefully that was helpful.
No, that was helpful, talking about the mindset shift. But that reminded me of just like a quick digression. So when I graduated school, I was like, okay, yeah, I want to get a house or whatever. So I remember talking to this financial planner that I was working with, and she was like, yeah, just go get a mortgage. And I was like, yeah, it doesn't work like that anymore. It doesn't work like how it was the first time you bought your house 30 years ago. They're not just handing out mortgages that easily. So I was like, you have to have some sort of backing for them to want to give you something. So yeah, it's not the same kind of system. So don't feel bad when, your uncle who bought his house 30 years ago and went to school for $10,000 tells you that you are not doing things the way you're supposed to be, because the world has changed. And so when it comes to consolidating loans for clients, what kind of an interest rate are you seeing? Are you seeing people right now getting below 5? You mentioned that.
Yeah. And so I also think, I think there's the word consolidation and refinance get used interchangeably. I use the term consolidation when I'm talking about combining the loans within the federal system, simply because that's what the federal system calls it. But refinancing would be the term to use, like when someone's taking either their federal loans or their existing private loans to a private company in hopes to get a lower interest rate and better terms. And so refinancing right now, we're seeing really great rates, weirdly, because before COVID, we were seeing really low interest rates too. COVID hit, and then interest rates spiked. They went up, 1%, 2%. It was really, really unfortunate. And then since then, they've started to teeter back down. And now we're in an environment where interest rates are lower than what they were pre-COVID. And so refinancing right now is really attractive for people where that makes sense. Like if they already have private loans, or if we're not needing the flexibility of the Fed system, or we're not going towards forgiveness, now is a really great time to be refinancing. And, average what I'm seeing right now is anywhere between 3 and 5%. and it's going to be dependent on credit. It's going to be dependent on your occupation. That goes into their underwriting process. So occupation, income, credit, they look at all of that. And then, but I had someone the other day get approved for like 3.4. And I was like, whoa, that's really nice. I like that number.
How long does that, like consolidation versus refinance, how long does that process take? Because typically if you refinance a house, it takes 30, 45 days. What does it look like when you refinance or consolidate loans?
So with refinancing, so taking the debt to a private company, you know your rate really quickly. Like they'll tell you either right on the spot when you apply, or you'll know within like a week or so. The process for money to exchange hands, that's usually within 30 days. You probably won't have a payment though for maybe 60 days from when you started the process. So it's relatively quick, and refinancing is really easy with student loans. There's no fees associated with it. Usually there's a lot of companies that are giving like cash back now, like if you decide to go with their company. So they're literally paying you to refinance with them. And so that's pretty easy. Consolidation, or combining the loans in the Fed system, that doesn't change your interest rate. Well, it kind of does. It takes your weighted average of your existing rates. So it doesn't really make it worse or better, but that process takes between 30 to 90 days, usually probably closer to the 90-day time frame. So
yeah, that's a good point. Like I think sometimes people forget that like your debt is an asset to someone else, right? Like obviously most people are thinking about assets from the vantage point of like the stock market or real estate or things of that nature. But like if someone, owns your debt, right? You're paying them 3, 4, 5, 6, 7%. That's an asset for them. I think our last episode, we had someone talking about like, quote unquote, becoming your own bank, right? And so like, if you look at what the banks do, they lend, right? And so it's just important to remember that like in this whole grand scheme of things, like your debt is an asset to somebody else. And so of course, through working with people like you, you can have a strategy to strategically get out of it, but just never forgetting that. I think sometimes like, whether it's credit card debt or student loan debt, like, people are excited about the leverage, but sometimes not connecting the dots that like, that is an asset for someone else. And what made that come to mind is when you said that they gave somebody like cash back or whatever, right? Like she's like, sure, I'll give them cash. I'm about to get them for 15. I'm about to get them paying me for 15 years. I'll give them a little cash back, on the front end. So, but I get it though. Like at the end of the day, if you're in the situation, if you have debt, the key at this point is just to be as strategic as possible. But it just reminded me that like it is an asset for someone else.
So it's funny that that's where your mind went, because my mind went to like, okay, there must be a lot more competition in the industry for them to offer cash back now. Because it didn't used to be like that 5, 7, 10 years ago. It was like, you have a couple options to refinance. Now it seems like there's a whole slew. So is that what you're seeing right now? Like more options to refinance? More people getting into the game?
Yeah, definitely. There's lots of companies you can choose from. Your bank or your credit union probably has some kind of option too. And so it is getting harder and harder for them to differentiate themselves from one another. The refinancing is a commodity. Like you just want to get the lowest interest rate possible.
Sure.
And if the next company is going to give you that, there's no reason to choose one over the other. And because there's no fees, again, there's no fees associated with refinancing. There's no like prepayment penalties to pay extra with these companies. And so the only other thing that really differentiates them is maybe customer service. But, at the end of the day, how super important is that if you can get like, a smaller interest rate somewhere? I don't know. It's been really interesting. So yeah, that's exactly what it is these cashback opportunities are to sway somebody one way or another, because they don't really have any other way to do that anymore.
Yes, it's boring. It's not sexy, right? It's like, hey, you can come over here and get your debt for a little less. So it's not as exciting as a conversation. So that makes sense.
Well, it doesn't sound like, I was going to ask you if you had like a top 3 favorite companies to like refinance at, but it doesn't sound like you do.
Not really. I mean, they're I will say from client feedback, I get really great feedback on Common Bond, Earnest, and I think everybody knows SoFi because of their commercials. They're probably pretty good too. But those are the best from a customer service perspective. Again, I tell people when they're going to refinance, shop 2 to 4 different companies because we just want the company that's going to give us the best rate. And then sometimes some clients are interested in doing this, and maybe some of the listeners might be too, but I tell folks, pin them up against each other. And so, what I mean by that is, if you get an offer from one company and then an offer from a different company and they're a little bit different, you can take that better offer to the one that gave you the worst rate and say, hey, this company is going to give me X. What can you give me? And send them like the letter. And then you can kind of work your way down to their floor. And I've seen it happen. I've seen it be successful. And that's just a way that you can continue to reduce how much you're going to pay in interest over time. So if you're interested in that, you want to do the effort, I've seen it be successful.
Got it. One more quick question while I'm thinking about it. Is there any situation outside of just like getting a more favorable interest rate where consolidation or refinancing is not a good move, right? Because on the outset, it just seems like if you can get a lower rate, why not refinance or consolidate? But is there any situation where it's like not advisable?
Yeah. So, and I talk about this quite a bit because I work primarily with people who have over 6 figures of student loan debt, and refinancing is a permanent decision. So if we take our loans out of the Fed system to a private company, we cannot go back to the Fed system if we needed that flexibility. And so I encourage people to think long and hard, like, hey, are you completely comfortable with not having access to income-driven plans, with not having access to forgiveness opportunity, and also not having access to potentially whatever this next administration might do for federal loans? Because if we take our loans private, that is a permanent decision we cannot change our mind about. And, we are now at the whim of that company, and we have committed ourselves to paying it off. So I talk about that, and COVID was a perfect example of just how flexible federal loans can be because they did get the 0% interest and the payment freeze while private borrowers didn't have anything. And so I talk about that. And, if someone feels very comfortable with their income, with the payment that we're looking at for refinancing, and they're okay with kind of walking away from that, then yeah, refinancing is the way to go. But if they need that flexibility, even if it's just for like another year or two, I always encourage people to stay in the Fed system a little bit longer, just in case. But if someone's going towards forgiveness, like public service loan forgiveness or the longer term taxable forgiveness, we do not need to be refinancing because we will take that off the table. So those are the biggest times, I would say.
Awesome. That's great feedback.
Yeah, we appreciate that. So let's shift more to the incoming, which I think when we drop this, they will be the current administration technically, but let's shift to them a little bit more. So as far as that goes, let's hear like your initial thought of when we're like, okay, Biden is elected. Like what was that back in November? So what was your thought? Like, okay, Biden is coming in. What does that do for student loans?
So I definitely, my thoughts were that things were going to get more favorable for federal student loan borrowers. I have been very conservative in my thoughts about forgiveness. I think there's been a lot of talk about like 50,000 of forgiveness or 10,000 or all loans forgiven. And in my mind, like, yes, that would be nice. But I don't think our country can afford it. And I don't know how definitely like widespread forgiveness. Like I never really thought that would come to fruition. The 50,000 or 10,000 was interesting. I think the 10,000 is something that we could still maybe be entertaining here coming up, but I'm not banking on it. And I'm telling people to guard their heart because I'm not convinced that it would happen. If it did, it would probably only happen for folks who were already in extreme need. So people who were completely or directly impacted by COVID, or people who are in default. Like I think those are the folks that might be helped more. But that's still to be determined. But in general, I felt like things would still get more favorable for borrowers, and I still think that.
Awesome.
Losing my voice. I'm losing my voice right now.
I caught that. I wasn't sure.
Hopefully you can cut that out.
Are we talking you to death now? Just kidding. No, just kidding.
Well, okay, so that's good to know what you were thinking initially. So right now, you're still thinking that like $10,000 to $50,000 could be on the table. I will give you my like taking off my planner hat, kind of putting on like my personal hat, how I feel about the 10 to 50,000. So I feel like 50,000 is too much. I agree with you on the fact of like, I don't know that our country can necessarily afford to forgive that much in student loans. I'm a little bit warmer on the 10,000, partially because being a student during this, like, it's more of a student loan crisis right now, right? Because a good example is your uncle says that you're irresponsible for taking out so much in student loans. We've been in a different kind of student loan environment. And, you know, when we were in school, it was like, here, take this money, take this money, you know, take this money. There was a lot of scamming, I feel like, going on with these loan companies, wherein like I know I received like my Pell, right, which is where my student loans would have gone had I taken student loans. So I had like a little Pell debit card, and I used that a couple times. And me being just, you know, the financial guru at 19 that I was checking the account and I was like, okay, why does it charge me 50 cents every time I swipe my card? Like, that's really expensive for me to swipe this debit card. So to me, okay, so then actually subsequently, I was given like a $200 check later in the year. And with that check, there was a letter that said, hey, basically, our company has been scamming you. Like, we're giving you back all the money for all of those swipes. So I was like, okay, that was when I was first alerted to, all right, these companies aren't really doing like what's in the client's best interest. They're not doing what's in the student's best interest. So I felt like students were being taken advantage of. So with that, that's why I'm a little bit warmer on 10,000 of student loan forgiveness and, you know, being a little bit more lenient there. But to your point of like, can our country really afford it? I really don't. I don't know about that. What are your thoughts, Troy?
Yeah, I mean, I understand, you know, monetary policy, and I understand how all that stuff works on a macro level. But, you know, when you see the country being able to, and again, at the expense of what, you know, the ramifications are still yet to be determined, but print billions of dollars at will, right? You just start to wonder, like, you know, how much does all this even really matter, right? You know, in the grand scheme of things, like, you know, I feel like the country could get creative and figure out a way to make this something that's sustainable. And at the end of the day, it's about the health of the economy, right? So even if there were some type of clause in there where it's like, okay, if this is forgiven, you know, for the people who are already making payments, like this money has to cycle back. Like, I don't know the nuance of what that would look like, but I feel like there's a way. And so for me, I feel like, you know, the smart people who are much smarter than me could put their heads together and figure out like, okay, if we were to do this, how could we not break as a country, right? Because we've proven that if we need to, with the push of a button, sometimes it takes a little longer to push that button because of politics, but with the push of a button, we can get money out to people, right? We can make things go away. And when I just look at the country as a whole and, you know, homelessness and so many other issues, I'm like, I feel like this would be a step in the right direction for our country, figuring out how to put people on more stable foundation. The challenge is there's still no control with what people do with that cash flow, right? And so it's like, you know, without the knowledge of people like Jacqueline or you, Meagan, or me, like, are they going to do the right thing? It goes back to that age-old adage about like the lottery, right? Like, if you don't have financial literacy and you get a windfall of X amount of dollars, what are you going to do with it? So I understand. I see both sides of it. I'm leaning more towards finding a way to forgive and trusting in the spirit of the people, right, to a degree. But I do understand that there's no guarantees there. So, yeah.
I also think too, like, there's a lot of talk about the symptoms here and the symptoms is the crazy amount of student loan debt that people graduate with. When I don't think there's a lot of talk about the source of that problem. And I honestly feel like there is a bigger problem on the front side of this equation, and that's the availability of or the ability for these institutions, these colleges, to basically charge whatever they want to charge. The cost of attendance, there is no incentive for colleges to keep the cost of attendance down, because we as a nation now have accepted the fact that, well, and it may not even be a fact these days, but have accepted the thought that to go and, make income and be a good person in this, nation, you have to have a degree and you have to have a good job. And to have a good job, you have to have a degree. And so the need is there. The need is definitely there. And there is no cap on what these institutions can charge either. Like there's caps on how much you can borrow for undergrad, but graduate schools and this might shock y'all, but a dental school in New York recently posted their cost of attendance for 4 years of an education in dentistry there. That price tag is over $700,000 for the cost of attendance. And in a graduate degree program, you can borrow up to the cost of attendance. So we're going to see huge balances continuing to, the problem is not going to be stopped by just forgiving debt. I think the problem needs to be addressed. That's solving maybe a symptom. That's like giving somebody Advil.
Yeah.
I think the problem needs to start with, the cause of that pain, and more conversations need to be had about that side of it, because it is getting very, very interesting, very outrageous. My worst case, if y'all could guess, the highest debt load I have advised on, could y'all take a guess at how much that was for one person?
I'm gonna go full blown 7-figure. Why not? $1 million. $1 million.
Why did we both think the same number? I was like, I'm gonna go with $1 million. If you said 700,000, it's gotta be like, I'm gonna go 1.2.
Yep. So my worst case, or the highest debt load case, was $1,029,000 for one person. He's a orthodontist. So if you want to be a highly specialized physician or dentist or anything, you're going to have lots of schooling, and that price tag is going to be high.
Here's my big concern or macro theory on all of this, right? Especially for the younger generation. I think that a couple things are bound to happen if we don't see some corrections here, and maybe just supply and demand will correct it. So here's what I see, right? The younger generation, the world is way different, right? And maybe we're partially in the younger generation, but they can make money doing anything, right? They can make money streaming video games, being influencers on Instagram, making TikTok videos. And I think what's going to happen if the cost of education for these more specialized skills, wanting to be attorney or a doctor, you're going to see more and more people no longer dreaming or aspiring to do those things, which is a problem, right? Because we need, I'm glad that there's plenty of ways to make money easily in this country. I mean, there's kids that are making $50,000 a month drop shipping products because they understand digital advertising, right? But you got to understand the psyche of that kid. It's right, okay. There used to be a time where this prestigious education was a badge of honor, or I aspired to be a doctor or an astronaut. But if I got to go out and get multi-6-figure debt to do that, and I can just get in front of a camera or build a platform and make money even before I get to college, what incentive is there for me to go into all that debt? And so what you're going to see is less and less people pursuing that level of higher education, which then is going to cause a whole nother crisis in society, right? When these other doctors are ready to retire, and what does that look like, right? Unless robots come in and can perform surgery and all sorts of stuff. So I think that's a really big issue. I think that might force colleges to reevaluate, because if they start to see the demand, supply and demand 101, it's well, the demand go down, they're going to start giving it away, right? Giving away. It's hey, come sign up just so we can keep our doors open. And I see that being a potential really big problem. I also see, as it relates to COVID, kind of a decentralization of how we even view higher education, right? I don't think that it's going to be as big of a thing to like, if I live in New York to where like I want to go to a school in California, like that I have to do that, right? I think it's going to be more like satellite locations. And then you have to evaluate, like, does it make sense to pay what I'm paying if I'm not going to this campus? And so I do think a lot of that type of stuff is bound to happen on the horizon. And if the educational system doesn't get ahead of that, then it could be bad for everybody, right? It could be good for students in the short term, but bad for our society when there's more and more people who are not going out these professional degrees that are needed, right? So, we'll see. It'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think some of it goes back to what you're saying, Meagan, about just our thoughts on accumulating debt and our thoughts on going to school. We have entire investment accounts that are set up for you to save money for college. But I think some of that issue is, they don't have any rules as far as what tuition costs. So because I was just kind of a little nerd when I was finishing up college, I watched the cost of tuition after we graduated, because we walked together. I was a little bit after you, but we walked together. So after that, so we graduated in May. I was looking for what the cost of tuition was going to be in the fall, and tuition jumped up 8%. I was like, whoa, like an 8% jump. I was like, I'm glad that I'm done. But to me, that's crazy, because if anything else that you had, money that you were planning to put into jumped up 8%, like your thoughts on obtaining that are going to be different. You're going to think, okay, is there another route that I can go? How can I redirect this to avoid this 8% increase? But because it's our thoughts on school and we're just going to go because we have to go, it doesn't matter if I need to take out more student loans or if I need to, potentially stop looking at federal and start looking at private. It doesn't matter, because I'm just going to keep going to this particular school. So I think you're right that our thoughts on debt need to change. I think that, I don't know that we could necessarily place sort of like caps on colleges like we have on gas. Like there are federal caps on gas. That way gas for your car doesn't, end up costing you $40 a gallon. So I don't know that would ever happen with schools, but I think you're right, George. It'll just be a supply and demand. And eventually the cost of school you can't keep rising it at the same rate. What is the rate of inflation for the cost of tuition right now? I think it was.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah. So I was gonna say it was it varies between schools, but it could be anywhere on average between 5 to 8%. I think your 8% was right on point. But with COVID, and this is funny, the terms they use, they had an inflation or a cost of attendance freeze. Or I'm trying to think of the couple terms they used, but it was like, a tuition freeze is what they used over COVID, like for people who were coming back to school, in the spring, or who were in school in the spring and coming back to school in the fall. They had a tuition freeze. And I think a lot of people thought that meant different things, but all it meant was that they weren't going to implement that 5 to 8% of inflation. And so, that was, COVID was the only reason they were going to not increase the cost of attendance. They were going to drop it. That was the other thing that people were really upset about. They weren't going to drop the cost of attendance. And since everyone was at home, they weren't going to stop. The other thing that really made people mad was they weren't going to not charge out of state tuition. And so if you're doing like an online degree, basically, because you can't go back to school due to COVID reasons, and you're in like Georgia, but your school is in New York, you're still being charged out of state tuition. And so people were really upset about it, but it makes sense financially speaking for the schools to still charge, of course, what they had been charging, because they have debt obligations that they still have to pay. Doesn't matter if you can't come. They built, that building or that gym or that facility that they still have to pay back. And so from the financial institutions, financial planning, they have to charge what they were charging to stay afloat, because they already took on these debt obligations. And I get so salty about because Jacqueline at Kennesaw, they built that really nice gym and we never got to use it while we were there because it was under construction for 3 years, but we paid for it. That's for sure.
No, for sure.
Yeah. So the inflation with schools is just, it's out of this world. Because if we had 5 to 8% inflation on anything else, you're going to think twice about that. Yeah. Right. And as far as them not dropping the cost of tuition, it reminds me of working with entrepreneurs and helping them set their pricing for things and figuring out what their value is, because it's the schools are well, our value is still X, so we can't drop our price. So it's just funny remembering that your debt is somebody else's asset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed. Well, Jacqueline, did you have any other questions that you wanted to ask today?
No other questions. Did you have anything else you want to share last minute with anybody, Meagan?
I would say, I know we talked a lot about kind of the doom and gloom about student loans, but maybe to put a positive end to it, there is going to be a plan that's going to work for you. So if that's refinancing, if that's going towards forgiveness, really it just starts with taking a look at your student loan situation, head on. I think some people are scared to do that, but you will feel much better when you have a plan. I promise you. And then, just implementing and executing that plan, and that will help you look forward and look on to other goals of yours once the student loan piece is achieved. So, at the end of the day, your financial situation is down to you, not what Biden's going to do in office, not, if there's going to be $10,000 of forgiveness, not, if loans are forgiven, so let's get a plan together that's going to stand the test of time, and things can only get better from here is what I'm thinking as far as repayment goes. So I'll end it on that positive note.
Okay, cool. Well, if someone's man, she provides some really great insight, and I need some help with this stuff. Where can people find you to learn more about what you have going on?
Yeah, so I have a website, and my Instagram handle is Financial Coach Meagan, and I spell my name a little weird, Meagan. My mom says the Southern way. So you can find me there. I always am happy to do an introduction call to make sure that, I can add value to helping your situation. And if not, I'll be able to point you in the right direction, whether that be Jacqueline or, another advisor that could help you with your specific needs.
Got it. And as we close, one question that we ask all of our guests is, what does living life uncensored mean to you?
Oh, man. I think it just means, to me, I think it means, well, I should have thought about this longer, huh?
Just be as uncensored as you want.
I think really living uncensored is just doing what, and this sounds so cheesy saying it out loud, but doing just what truly makes you happy. And I think, student loan planning for me makes me so happy. And, no one else wants to talk about student loans. That's okay. But, I'll talk about it all day with you. So, don't let your student loan situation make you feel like you can't go out and do what you want to do. Because I see that too. I see folks really deeply regret what they went to school for because of their loans. And I'm telling you, don't feel that way. There's going to be a plan. Maybe that's a weird way for me to loop it back to having a plan on student loans, but that's maybe what I would say there.
Awesome. Well, Meagan, we greatly appreciate you coming on the show. I think you provided a lot of insight that our listeners will find immensely valuable. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.